I'm gonna take a shower, so clean this up. Tom indicates the suitcase with his chin. I nod slightly while holding it. Got it. You should be able to do at least this much without being told, really. With a huff, Tom headed to the bathroom. Watching him go, I sighed. Slowly lifting the suitcase. Something fell out with a rustle. Huh? What's this? Looking down, there was an envelope at my feet. Curious, I opened the envelope. What's this? Inside were a photograph and a divorce paper with Tom's signature. The included photo showed a woman and a child. This might be his way of saying he wants to split because he's got a mistress pregnant. Right, Tom said to clean this up. Meaning, he wants me to file this divorce. What a delightful surprise it's been a while since I've received. Surely, Tom must feel the same. I need to prepare a return gift. A wonderful return gift named Revenge. A smile crept over my lips as I gently slipped the envelope into my pocket. My name is Julie. I work as an office worker at a metal processing factory. Being an office worker in what you'd call a small-town factory, neither my salary nor bonuses are that big. But, living in a small town, I think life is relatively easy. Plus, my husband Tom is a business owner. That's another reason I don't think life is hard. By the way, Tom's company is a consulting firm. He seems to have clients all over the country, so he travels a lot. Maybe that's why we don't have kids. Both Tom and I are 38 now. Guess it's too late for kids now. I've started to think that way recently. Still, I don't plan on divorcing. A happy home can be built without children. That's what I believe. However, it's not like I don't have my worries. Tom has been distant lately, and we've been missing each other more. It's problematic that he relies solely on my income for living expenses, saying work is tough. But, I'm sure we can make it through if we're together. That's how I've been encouraging myself. There's a reason I think this way. It's because I know Tom from our student days. I met Tom when we were in high school. Tom was a popular guy in our school. He had leadership qualities, always leading the way at cultural festivals and sports days. If someone made a mistake, Tom would cover for them. If there was a problem, Tom would solve it. Tom was that kind of reliable person everyone depended on. On the other hand, I was a plain and quiet girl. Living my life trying not to stand out at all. It was as if that was my life goal. But meeting Tom made me want to try things on my own for the first time. During the discussion about the school event, I raised my hand and spoke up for the first time. Let's do a play for the day. Before I could finish, laughter leaked out from around me. That's because most of my group wanted to set up a cafe. Isn't a play hard to prepare for? Like, memorizing lines and all, sounds like a hassle. Amidst those comments, Tom spoke up to the classmates. Isn't it precisely because it's challenging that it's rewarding? Plus, it'll definitely be more memorable. Tom's words changed the atmosphere in an instant. In the end, we did a play for the school event. There's no doubt that this event brought Tom and me closer together. But, nothing happened, and we graduated high school. I got a job at a factory, and Tom went on to college. A few years later, we reconnected at a reunion, which led to us dating and eventually getting married. By then, Tom had become the president of a consulting firm. Needless to say, everyone was envious. But the reality wasn't so great. Tom's job was busy, with frequent business trips. We hardly spent time together at home. Despite the glamorous title of president, Tom's company was barely making it. We're thinking about expanding the business, so income might be lower for a while. Are you okay with that? Sure, the business foundation is stable now. But if we do nothing, we'll hit a dead end eventually. If current clients leave, income will drop. That could leave the employees stranded. As the president, Tom felt an obligation to support his staff. He said it was better to expand the business to attract more customers. This was the conversation not long after we got married. So, I couldn't quit my job even after we got married. In fact, my income was what we relied on. The salary Tom brought home was minimal. But we'll make it through if we keep at it. I believed in Tom and kept going. While I dedicated myself to my job, I was also handling all the housework alone. Of course, Tom, with his frequent business trips, had no time for chores. And on his days off, Tom looked utterly exhausted. So, I couldn't even ask him to help with the housework on those days. But, juggling work and housework is quite common in dual-income households today. Many people are managing just like that, so I can't say I'm the only one making an effort. However, I had another job. That was helping out Tom's parents. My father-in-law owned a small diner. It's an old establishment beloved by locals. Because the prices are low, the profit isn't much. Yet, customers kept coming non-stop. So many that my mother-in-law started helping out with serving and such. But it still wasn't enough. That's when I stepped in to help. So, on weekdays, I handled my office job and the housework, and on weekends, I helped at my in-laws' diner in the morning. I continued living this busy yet fulfilling life. It was hard. But the food my father-in-law made was delicious. I even learned to cook during breaks from work. So, I didn't mind helping at the diner. Though, there were times I wanted a break. But I couldn't say I wanted to rest with my in-laws. There was a reason for that. I had taken the initiative to help out, or so was the pretext. Julie, you're working as an office worker during the week, right? You don't have to push yourself to help out. I enjoy doing it. I answered my mother-in-law like that. But the truth was a bit different. In fact, Tom had asked me to help out his parents. Needless to say, I initially refused. Working even on weekends is a bit much. I really feel bad asking, but I'm worried about Dad and Mom. His parents had worked non-stop at the diner without much rest. However, they're over 60 now, and their health is declining. Recently, they've mentioned having pains all over, and Tom seemed really concerned. So, could you go and keep an eye on them at the diner? But I work during the week, and I have to catch up on housework on weekends, right? Then, we could hire a housekeeper for that. Doing that would jeopardize our household finances. It would be better to hire part-time help at the diner instead. After much thought, I agreed to help. But this decision was a big mistake. I realized that only recently. About 6 months ago. I have some work left, so I'll clean it up first. Then, I'll prepare dinner. I always appreciate it, thank you. Returning from work, I had such a conversation with Tom and started preparing dinner as usual. A while later, when I wanted to ask Tom about the seasoning for the dinner, I was about to knock on Tom's room when I heard his voice from inside. Give it up already, Dad. How long do you plan to keep running that dirty diner? Tom's words shocked me. But then, he continued with something even more unbelievable. You're only making chump change, right? It would be better to just quit. Chump change, Tom? That's a lie, right? Stunned, I lowered my hand from knocking. Or is it because our housekeeper is making you profit? The moment Tom said that, I could hear my father-in-law's voice over the phone. What do you think you're talking about, Julie? You need to stop. It was a very quiet voice, but for some reason, it clearly reached my ears. Tears started to flow instantly. I learned of Tom's true nature and my father-in-law's kindness. So, Tom wasn't worried about his parents. He just wanted to monitor them. And I was his surveillance tool. To Tom, I was just a convenient housekeeper. Anger welled up in me along with the frustration. I'll definitely divorce him. I resolved to divorce Tom. But suddenly initiating divorce is difficult. If I bring it up, it would only put me at a disadvantage. First, I need to gather evidence that will favor me in the divorce. The conversation just now, I could get testimony from my father-in-law. But that alone wouldn't be enough. If only there was something decisive. From that day on, I decided to closely monitor Tom's actions. Meanwhile, I acted as usual, pretending not to know anything and doing as Tom said. Maybe because of that, Tom didn't notice anything and treated me as usual. "Julie, could you prepare a present? Something for a baby would be great." "Baby? Why? Do you remember Nick from our wedding? He's an employee at my company." Apparently, Nick had a child, and Tom wanted to prepare a gift. But he's too busy with work to shop for presents. He wanted to give it before a business trip this weekend, so he asked me to buy it tomorrow. "Got it. Anything specific?" "I trust your taste. You'll know what's needed after birth." Tom smiled. I nodded with a smile. Thinking it wouldn't be right to involve unrelated people, I decided to follow his instruction. But the next day, after work, as I was about to enter a store selling baby products to buy the present, an unexpected encounter awaited me. Just as I was about to enter the baby supply store, someone called out from behind me. "Julie, right?" Turning around, a man in a suit was standing there. He was well dressed and seemed like a nice young man. I felt I had seen him somewhere before and, after thinking for a bit, realized he was Nick from my husband's company. "Oh, Nick, from my husband's company. Yes, I'm always grateful for your support." "No worries." "Oh, are you buying a gift for your wife?" I gestured towards the baby store in front of us. However, Nick looked puzzled. "No, I'm not married." His words made me tilt my head in confusion. Tom had definitely said that Nick had a baby. Wondering what was going on, I asked Nick for more details. What I found out was something I hadn't expected at all. Nick was indeed there to buy baby items, but not for his wife. It was, astonishingly, for Tom. This was a real shock. It meant that Nick was informed by Tom that I was pregnant. Needless to say, I immediately denied it. At that point, Nick seemed to harbor suspicions as well. We decided to move to a different location and talked more. As a result, Tom's lies were exposed one after another. Firstly, while it's true that Tom's company was expanding, the salaries hadn't decreased. On the contrary, due to the business expansion, the employees' salaries had increased, including apparently Tom's. Moreover, Tom's business trips were a lie. There were business trips, but not as frequent as he claimed. At most, it was once a month. Recently, we can handle most things online, and the need to meet clients in person has decreased, Nick explained. So, Tom was lying about business trips and going somewhere else. Additionally, he tried to get baby items by pretending I was pregnant. The only conclusion I could draw from this was that Tom was having an affair, and the other woman was pregnant. And the salary he hadn't been bringing home was likely being spent on his mistress. I was so enraged I could hardly keep myself together. In that moment, Nick kindly spoke to me. "He has always been prone to affairs. I'll help, so gathering evidence and divorcing might be best." Needless to say, I took Nick up on his offer. I immediately started gathering evidence. Nick would assist with monitoring Tom's actions at the company. At the same time, I hired a professional investigator to check on his conduct. Moreover, to ensure Tom didn't catch on, both Nick and I bought baby items. And we pretended we knew nothing, handing them over to Tom. "Then, I'll give this to Nick. And I'm off on a business trip for the next 2 weeks. Okay, take care." I sent him off, pretending to be unaware of anything. 2 weeks later, Tom came home late at night, quite drunk. "Are you okay? Where did you drink?" "That's none of your business. Just clean the bathroom." His tone was unusually harsh. I frowned slightly and sighed quietly. "What, you got a problem?" "I want to drink when I feel like it." "I know." I supported Tom as he seemed about to fall. Then, Tom brushed off my hand. "I'm gonna take a shower, so clean this up." Tom indicated the suitcase with his chin. I nodded slightly while holding it. "Got it. You should be able to do at least this much without being told, really." With a huff, Tom headed to the bathroom. Watching him go, I sighed. Slowly lifting the suitcase. Something fell out with a rustle. Huh? What's this? Looking down, there was an envelope at my feet. Curious, I opened the envelope. What's this? Inside were a photograph and a divorce paper with Tom's signature. And the enclosed photo showed a woman and a child. This might be a statement of intent from Tom, wanting a divorce because his mistress had a child. Yes, Tom said to take care of it. Meaning, he wants me to file this divorce form. Such a delightful present hasn't come my way in a while. Surely, Tom must have felt the same. I need to prepare a return gift. A beautiful return gift named Revenge. I smiled as I gently slid the envelope into my pocket. Then I opened the suitcase. But it had been laundered. I see, a declaration of war, huh? It's odd for a suitcase to be completely laundered after a business trip. No housewife would think this normal. There's a woman out there laundering for him. Meaning, it's a declaration of war from the mistress, saying she's the one laundering now. And this time, she even included a photo. With a divorce form as a bonus. Probably, Tom's agitation was because of this. Being pressured to divorce by his mistress. But Tom didn't want to let go of me, a convenient housekeeper. Probably, they had a fight. And the angry mistress planted the divorce form and photo. Well, I guess that's how it is. So, I have no choice but to accept the challenge, right? Grinning, I went back to my room. If it were up to me, I'd file the divorce form right away. But if I'm divorcing, I need a place to move to. And I'd like to say goodbye to Tom's parents. Looks like I'll be busy tomorrow. I spent a sleepless night excited for what was to come. And the next morning, I said to Tom as he woke up. Tom, it's peak season at my company. So, I'll be coming home late for a while. Is that so? Tough for you too. After such a conversation, I left the house with Tom. But instead of going to work, I returned home. At the same time, I contacted my company to resign. Of course, I had a reason for doing this. In fact, I had informed my father about the divorce last night. Then this morning, my father sent me an email saying, "You might cause trouble at work because of the divorce. Quit your job and come back immediately. I'll arrange a place for you to live and find you a new job. Don't worry about anything." So, I decided to resign immediately. Also, I started preparing to move out at home. And by evening, I finished moving with the help of movers arranged by my father. After that, I filed the divorce form and got introduced to a competent lawyer by my father. Now, all I have to do is wait for Tom to contact me. I drank alcohol while watching my parents' house through a network camera in my new place. I was enjoying some relaxing time for the first time in a while when suddenly my phone started ringing. It was Tom. I checked and ignored it. This repeated several times, and then the doorbell at my parents' house rang. After a while, I saw my father and Tom at the entrance on the camera. I watched the situation unfold with a grin. What's the matter, coming at this hour? I can't get in touch with Julie. Oh? Isn't she at work? Tom's face turned blue at my father's words and he looked down. No, her stuff is gone from the house. All my belongings were gone. And no response no matter how many times he called. When Tom contacted my company, they said I had resigned. Tom explained all this in a rush. Listening to this, my father asked Tom, "Don't you have any idea why?" No, I don't know anything. Tom answered hesitantly, wiping the sweat that kept appearing. He probably couldn't confess about the affair. As I thought this, my father suddenly raised his voice. There must be something you're aware of, right? Tom flinched at my father's stern voice. Looking away, Tom answered, "No, nothing at all." Don't lie. You were cheating, weren't you? Cheating? Tom's eyes began to dart around. His reaction was just as good as a confession. Still, my father didn't let up with his questions. Staring at Tom, he continued in a firm tone. "We have evidence, but do you want to see it? Or will you confess on your own? Which is it?" "I'm sorry. It was just a moment of weakness. Please, don't tell Julie." "Enough. You don't have the right or qualification to say such things." Tom fell silent at my father's rebuke. My father eyed the subdued Tom. "Anyway, Julie intends to divorce you." "What? Wait, please." "There's no use talking to me. If Julie asks for alimony, you better comply. Got it?" "Yes," Tom said in a small voice. Of course, I laughed heartily in front of the camera. Watching Tom trudge back home lifted my spirits a bit. Well, this isn't over yet. Muttering, I picked up my phone. Naturally, I called my father-in-law. I reported to my father-in-law that I had filed for divorce. "So, I've filed for divorce." "That idiot son, what is he doing?" My father-in-law began to rage over the phone. While calming him, I made a request. "So, that's the situation. Can I count on you?" "All right. Since my son has caused you trouble, I won't hold back my support." Thus, I secured my father-in-law's cooperation. The next day, during lunchtime, I called Tom. I expected him to pick up immediately, but he didn't. "What's with all those missed calls?" As soon as Tom realized I was gone, he bombarded me with calls. Yet, when I call, he shows no sign of picking up. Last night, he was warned by my father to comply with the alimony discussion. I see. He's preparing for a total war. Annoyed, I quickly changed and took a taxi to Tom's office. Upon entering the office, Tom, noticing me, came rushing out from the back room. "What are you doing here, Julie?" "I came to discuss our divorce." "Since you wouldn't answer your phone." I deliberately raised my voice. Naturally, all eyes in the office turned towards us. "Hey, don't raise your voice here." "Afraid your subordinates will find out about the affair? Or because you lied about me being pregnant?" The office began to buzz immediately. Tom had apparently announced to his colleagues that his wife was pregnant. I heard about this from Nick. He seemed quite happy announcing it during a company-wide morning meeting. Meaning, me denying the pregnancy here would expose Tom's lie. As Tom began to receive wary looks from his employees, he led me outside. "Oh? Ready to talk about alimony? Let's change the location first." Tom was visibly irritated. He took me to a nearby cafe. After ordering something and sending the waiter away, Tom began to complain in a low voice. "What's your intention? Want to disgrace me? If you do something like that, I'll be in a tight spot." "Huh? It's your fault for lying. Why did you lie?" When I asked, Tom suddenly fell silent. Always goes silent when it gets inconvenient for him. "I've already filed for divorce anyway." "Huh? You filed for divorce? How? You didn't forge it, did you?" Seeing an opportunity, Tom smirked. But I replied calmly. "Oh? It was in the suitcase. Along with the mistress's photo." Smiling, Tom was taken aback. Seems like he remembered something. Then, I called a certain person. I shared my location for them to come. "Who are you calling?" "Someone who will help us with the discussion. They said they'll be here soon, so we'll continue after that." Apparently, they were nearby, waiting. The person arrived at the cafe within minutes. Immediately, Tom's face went pale. Soon, he began to tremble. The person stood in front of Tom. "Tom, I hear you've been cheating?" "Mom, it's not what it looks like." The person who entered was my mother-in-law. Behind her was my father-in-law. This was precisely what I had asked my father-in-law for yesterday. I wanted my mother-in-law's support when Tom complained. Tom may act arrogantly towards my father-in-law, but he can't stand up to my mother-in-law. She's a person of strong moral principles and quite serious. That's why Tom has been scolded by her since he was little. And it seems he's still scared of her. Why then would he cheat? It was obvious he would get scolded if found out. I was astonished at what he was thinking. While I was pondering, Tom was being scolded by my mother-in-law right in front of me. What on earth were you thinking? But it's not like that. What do you mean it's not like that? Julie told me everything. I've also seen the results of your initial investigation. My mother-in-law placed an envelope on the table. It was the results of Tom's conduct investigation that I had given her. I've seen it too, and there's no doubt about the cheating. Shut up, Dad. Tom raised his voice towards my father-in-law. However, my mother-in-law quickly intervened. You're the one who should be quiet. Before getting angry at us, you should be apologizing to Julie. Huh? Come on. Apologize now. My mother-in-law urged Tom in a stern tone. Tom quickly averted his gaze. At that moment, my mother-in-law's anger exploded. She grabbed Tom by the neck. Yes. You need to apologize. I'm sorry. What about alimony? I'll pay. Please forgive me. Tom's voice was choked, almost crying. I found the sight irresistibly funny. After being scolded by my mother-in-law, Tom agreed to pay the alimony. I told him I'd have my lawyer contact him with the details and left the scene. After leaving the cafe, I muttered to myself. Now for that woman. I stared at the photo of the mistress saved on my phone. Soon after, my lawyer contacted me to say Tom had paid the alimony. That settles it then. I finally felt relieved. But it wasn't over yet. There was one more thing to do. That was my revenge on the mistress. The revenge was scheduled for a few days later. I waited excitedly for that day. Days flew by, and the day arrived. Trying to contain my excitement, I headed to the venue. It was a business networking event. This time, it was hosted by the Chamber of Commerce. I exchanged greetings and first looked for Tom. Soon, I found him and approached him from behind. Long time no see, Tom. Julie? Why are you here at a business networking event? Tom was surprised as I handed him my business card. He looked at it and exclaimed in surprise. I've become a real estate business owner. What do you mean? Just took over from my dad. I answered with a smile. Meanwhile, Tom looked confused and asked back. No, your dad is a taxi driver, right? So I also. Tom talked about not asking my father for financial support. Indeed, my father is a taxi driver. But that was more like a hobby. While running a real estate rental business, my dad liked to drive, so he worked as a taxi driver. But with Tom's cheating coming to light, I decided to quit my job. Of course, if the discussion had gone smoothly, I might not have had to quit. However, my father said it was a good opportunity and offered to transfer his company to me. He even said he would rent me one of his properties as my new home. So, I decided to take over my father's business. Of course, there are various challenges. But I'm not just inheriting properties from my father. I've become the president of the management company he founded. My job mainly involves dealings with real estate management companies that actually manage the properties. And I'm taking over the operation of a few small properties not managed by the company. It's not much work, so I'm not really busy at the moment. But I'm going to get serious from now on, so I wanted to talk to various people today. That's why I attended the business networking event. Tom was taken aback by this revelation. While we were talking, a man approached us. Long time no see, Tom. Simon. Always grateful for your support. I smirked beside him. Oops, did I interrupt something? No, not at all. Rather. As Tom turned his back on me, I pushed him aside. Stepping forward, I bowed to the person Tom called Simon. Nice to meet you, Simon. I'm Julie, Tom's ex-wife. Ex-wife? Simon's complexion changed. I pretended not to notice and continued. We just got divorced recently. My husband cheated and fathered a child with another woman. Stop it. Don't say any more unnecessary things. Tom tried to silence me, but I forcefully told everything. Hearing this, Simon placed his hand on Tom's shoulder with a strained face. What's all this about? Well, that. Tom's mouth moved, but no words came out. I silently cheered inside. Then, a sweet voice was heard. Daddy! Did you find Tom? Turning towards the voice, there was a flashy woman. She saw Tom and hurried over. Tom! I found you! She hugged Tom in an irritating manner. Tom, with a pale face, pushed the woman away. Feeling the atmosphere freeze, I deliberately said, Oh? Isn't this Hannah, Tom's mistress? Nice to meet you. Huh? Who are you? Tom's ex-wife. What? Hannah was cut off mid-sentence. Simon then pulled Hannah towards him. Hannah, what's all this about? No, this woman is weird. Hannah pointed at me. While she played dumb, I explained the situation to everyone. Turns out, Hannah and Simon were parent and child, and she had introduced Tom as her husband. However, Hannah and Simon weren't living together. But Simon frequently visited Hannah. And each time he did, Tom met Simon as Hannah's husband. That was the real nature of Tom's business trips. Realizing this, I divorced Tom. After telling Simon all this, his face turned red with anger. You two lied. No, it's not like that. I didn't know. Hannah feigned ignorance. Then, I pulled out the photo from the envelope. Here's a photo of Hannah and her child. On the back, it says this. Flipping the photo, it read, Since it's like this, please divorce soon. Simon raised his voice upon seeing the handwriting. This is Hannah's handwriting, isn't it? You knew Tom was married. No. Afterwards, Simon lectured Tom and Hannah right there. The two admitted to lying, knowing about the affair but unable to give up. Hannah repeated this, while Tom said, I was planning to divorce soon. Then why didn't you immediately agree to the divorce discussions? My question exposed Tom's lies. It was downhill from there. Eventually, Hannah agreed to pay me alimony. She would work under Simon to pay it off. As for Tom, his punishment was the cessation of their business dealings. Simon informed Tom on the spot about stopping their transactions. Needless to say, many people witnessed this. It was inevitable that Tom's company would lose credibility. Not long after, Tom's company went bankrupt. Now, Tom is helping at his father-in-law's diner. Of course, while being scolded by his mother-in-law. Also, Tom's former company's clients were transferred to a new company. This company was started by Tom's former subordinates who found themselves without a place to go. Who's the president of the new company? I casually asked Nick, whom I went to thank for his help. It's me. So, how about we talk business over dinner? I have no intention of dating men right after getting divorced. But I want to talk more with him. Is this feeling love, or simply interest in business? I already know the answer. That's why I accepted his invitation. Your room was a mess, so I cleaned it up for you. The person who came out of my room, grinning and covering her mouth with her hand, was Mary, my son's wife. Oh, thank you. I had just cleaned the room a few days ago, but maybe I didn't realize it, but perhaps it looked dirty to someone else. I thought for a moment and decided to just say thank you for now. Mary, my daughter-in-law, doesn't do anything around the house. She's all about snide comments and throws a tantrum if things don't go her way. It was suspicious, to say the least, that Mary of all people had cleaned someone else's room. I don't know what you're plotting, but it's not gonna work. I muttered under my breath, making sure Mary, who was watching TV at full volume, couldn't hear me, and then I went back to my chores. The treatment I had received from them was far from minimal, and I had had enough. I've reprimanded them a few times before, but if they're gonna get carried away, they better be ready for what's coming. My name is Susan, and I'm already 73 years old. My husband John and I met through a mutual friend, and back then, we were both so shy we could barely hold a conversation, but now we enjoy chatting over coffee after meal. Shortly after we got married, I became pregnant with our son. My husband was so happy and helped around with chores and everything, even though he was clumsy at it. Eventually, our son got a job and moved out, and our once bustling house suddenly became quiet, leaving us feeling a bit lonely. Then our son brought home Mary, whom he was dating with the intention of marrying. When John and I first saw Mary, we thought she was very beautiful and well composed. With her long black hair neatly tied back and sitting straight, Mary looked dazzling. Ignoring our son, who was too nervous to speak coherently, we had a lot of conversations with Mary. We really like her. She's so lively and fun, we thought, and happily agreed to their marriage, urging our son to get the wedding organized right away. Then came the busy days of their honeymoon and moving to a new home, but we enjoyed those times as a couple too. We wanted to see our grandchildren, but it seemed our son and his wife had decided not to have children, and although we were a bit disappointed, we understood. We thought we were in for more peaceful days, but our expectations were dashed. The couple often found excuses to come back home. Like in the middle of summer, they said their AC was broken and stayed with us for a week until the repairman could come, or one winter day, they couldn't pay their electric bill and were almost freezing, so they stayed at our place until they could sort out the payment and get the electricity back on. At first, we felt sorry for them and accepted it, but watching them just leave all the contacting to the repair services or handling the bill payments to us and just lazing around, we gradually started to feel irritated. Of course, John saw all of this too, and even he, who had been so welcoming, now frowns and becomes silent whenever he sees our son and his wife. As for our son, he seems completely oblivious to how we feel, acting as if he can do whatever he wants like when he was a child. And now, they've decided to come back home again. Out of the blue, my son called the other day and said, "Hey, Mom? Next week, we're gonna head over," and that was it. No further contact, leaving me in the dark about when exactly they were planning to arrive. Then, suddenly, I got a call from Mary saying, "We'll be there soon, please be ready," and I had to rush to get things prepared. "You take care of the bedroom. I'll go buy the missing groceries." "It'd help if you could write down a list of what's needed," my husband, John, said before heading off to change. I thanked him and quickly wrote down what we needed for tonight's dinner, leaving the note on the living room table, then started to air out the blanket. When I returned to the living room, John was looking at the note. "Is this everything? If you remember anything else, just call me, and I'll pick it up." Seeing my husband leave with a smile and a chuckle after saying that, I couldn't help but smile myself. Just as I was pulling myself together and about to get out some clothes, a loud voice from the entrance called out, "Susan, are you there?" Startled by Mary's loud voice calling out for me without even ringing the doorbell, I hurried to open the door. "You know we were coming, you could have at least left the door open," she said, entering with a sense of entitlement, which made me sigh involuntarily. Hearing that, she instantly furrowed her brows and retorted with a complaint. "What's that for? We came all this way to see you. Don't you think that's rude?" I wanted to throw her words right back at her, but held back and instead invited Mary in. "Isn't Daniel with you?" I asked, noticing the absence of my usually noisy son, and quickly addressed Mary, who was relaxing on the living room sofa. "Oh, he got caught up with your husband and went shopping." I was irritated by her disinterested demeanor as she fiddled with her nails while answering, but I just gave a brief acknowledgement and decided to go get some clothes again. After doing the laundry, I started preparing for dinner, but all the while, Mary didn't move an inch. She just sat there, eating her snacks and laughing crudely at the TV from time to time. Later, as I was preparing dinner, Mary suddenly stood up and left the living room. I thought she might have gone to the bathroom and didn't pay much attention, but when she came back, she seemed unusually cheerful. "Just when I was feeling suspicious, your room was a mess." I had no choice but to clean it up for you. I was taken aback by her sudden statement. Apparently, she had gone into my room and rummaged around. The audacity of entering someone else's room without permission bothered me, especially since I had just cleaned it recently along with the guest room, making me wonder what she could have possibly cleaned, but for the time being, I still thanked her. Mary seemed pleased with herself and went back to lounging smugly on the living room sofa. Just then, my husband and my son came back. Expecting my son and his wife to stay for a few days, I felt bad for John but had asked him to buy a significant amount. Fortunately, they arrived just in time, so John had enlisted Daniel as his pack mule. From the looks of it, Daniel was loaded down with bags, so it seems they accomplished their mission. Overcoming the sight of Daniel slumped at the entrance with the bags, John handed me the items he bought. After thanking him, I took out what was needed right away and put the rest in the fridge. "Hey, Daniel. Don't just sit there, bring everything over here." John scolded our son, who was still sitting at the entrance, and then went to the kitchen to pour some water and headed to the living room. My son, though reluctantly, carried all the bags in several trips. "I'm beat. Mom, give me some water." "Do it yourself." John barked again at our son, who was pleading thirstily like a child, but I prepared it anyway with a resigned smile. "Welcome back, and thanks. I'll start making dinner soon, so just wait a bit." Yeah, Daniel replied as he took the water and went to sit next to Mary in the living room, quickly emptying his glass. Meanwhile, I started preparing for dinner, but there was no sign of Mary offering to help at all. I wasn't expecting anything from the start, and frankly, I was wary that if she offered to help, she might mess something up or cause more trouble, making things take even longer, so I'd rather she didn't. Somehow, we got everything ready and had dinner. It ended up being a simple meal since everything was so rushed, but my son Daniel didn't say anything, and there were no complaints from Mary, so I took that as a win. After dinner, there was a relaxed atmosphere as my husband John and the couple watched TV. There was no conversation, but that was far better than any argument. I closed the tap at a good moment and left the living room to give the couple their pajamas. On my way to the living room with the pajamas, I bumped into my husband coming out of the bathroom. "Should Daniel go first?" "I'll go last." "Oh no, you've been out shopping, I can't let you wait." I entered the living room with a chuckle, only to find my son dozing off. "Daniel, don't sleep here. Go ahead." I laid the pajamas over my indifferent son and handed Mary hers. Mary initially took the pajamas but quickly handed them back with a frown. "I prefer the ones I wore before. They weren't this flimsy." I was taken aback by Mary's demand, but knew arguing would only lead to her throwing a tantrum, which would only complicate things further. "Oh, was that so? Just wait a moment." With a sigh, I went off to look again, while my son, acting as if he knew nothing of it, let out a big yawn and headed to the bathroom, barely acknowledging me. While I was looking for the pajamas Mary had mentioned, John popped his head in curiously. "Hey, do you know where my golf balls are?" "Oh, they're usually by the rack, aren't they?" "I can't find them." I pondered, tilting my head as I watched my husband John leave, and then I went to give Mary the new clothes. "These are the ones. They really are worth the price." Indeed, these were bought specifically for Mary's frequent stays, during a shopping trip we had together. Mary, knowing she wasn't paying, had insisted on the expensive items, and I had given in and bought them. "I'll go next, I don't want to follow an old person," Mary said nonchalantly, making me want to snap back, but just then, John returned to the living room, looking around helplessly. "Still no luck?" "Mary, do you know where the golf balls that are usually by the rack are?" John must have searched everywhere he could think of and decided to ask around as a last resort. Expecting a typical no-idea response, he was taken aback when she retorted, "I don't know anything about that. Are you suggesting I stole them? That's terrible, suspecting me like that." Her loud denial surprised me, and I froze in shock. John tried to explain it was a misunderstanding, but Mary was already in a rage. Then Daniel, fresh from shower, came back, and we all tried to calm the situation, but Mary remained sulky and stormed off to the bathroom. The living room fell silent after Mary left, filled with a heavy atmosphere. Daniel was grilling John about what had happened. He was noting how unusual it was for Mary to be so flustered. But really, why did she get so angry? Given Mary's usual behavior, I couldn't help but suspect her.
What's that supposed to mean? It sounds like you're accusing her.
Before I knew it, Daniel and John had started arguing. Now it was up to me to calm down the fight between my son and husband, which took quite a bit of time. While this was happening, Mary, fresh from shower, returned to the living room, making things even more complicated. Now John was being criticized by both my son and his wife. But John didn't back down. Especially after John scolded Mary for her behavior today, she threw another tantrum and stormed off into the guest room we had prepared for her. Daniel, cutting off John's attempts to calm things, continued to yell.
You're always blaming Mary, but you haven't apologized for suspecting her. You never really say sorry for anything, that's what I hate.
With no end to the argument in sight, John eventually said, "Do whatever you want," and retreated to his own room. The living room went silent again, and with a sigh, I decided to head to the bathroom. "I'm going to bed," Daniel muttered gruffly, heading towards the guest room, but I stopped him.
The guest room's bedding smells moldy, so sleep in my room, Daniel.
Mary's behavior while my husband and son were out shopping, and her overreaction to John's words, made her appear suspicious to me. Because of this, I couldn't shake the feeling that her claim of cleaning my room was part of some scheme. I felt a bit bad for Daniel, but I decided to use the guest room meant for him this time.
Your room? It's fine, I can handle a bit of mold. I'm not a kid anymore.
What are you talking about? What if you get pneumonia?
That's just it.
No, fine, I got it. Daniel made a face of displeasure but resigned himself and headed towards my room. I briefly glanced at the guest room Mary was using, unaware of this exchange, naturally upset. If nothing was amiss, then that was fine. If all was well, I planned to properly prepare the guest room for my son tomorrow. Daniel opened the door to my room and entered.
Wow!
I heard Daniel's loud scream and rushed towards the room, opening the door that was nearly closed. I turned on the light in the still dark room and was speechless. There, my son was writhing on the floor, holding his foot, surrounded by a scattering of golf balls. The golf balls John had been searching for were strewn all over my room. In the dark, Daniel must have stepped on them. Who would expect golf balls to be scattered across the room? Daniel had stepped on them, lost his balance, and in trying to steady himself, he put his weight in the wrong place and ended up falling. It seems he hit the floor hard with his whole body during the fall. He was barely holding his foot, groaning softly while tears flowed. It seemed like the loud noise had drawn both John and Mary out of their rooms. John looked over my shoulder into the room and said, "What is this?" as he tried to help Daniel up. But John also got his foot caught on a golf ball and nearly fell over just like Daniel. I turned around to see what was happening. There stood Mary, pale-faced and trembling.
Why? How could this happen? This is your mother's room.
Her voice was so soft, it could have been drowned out by John's frantic questioning of Daniel if I hadn't been paying attention.
Yes, this is my room.
And Mary, you said you cleaned it today, didn't you? My words made John and Daniel turn around, and Mary took a step back, flustered. When you cleaned, did you see these golf balls? I asked gently. Mary just stood there, trembling, silent.
Mary? Do you know anything about these golf balls?
Still, Mary remained silent.
Hey, Mary! What's going on? Answer me.
Daniel raised his voice, frustrated. But he was clearly in pain from hitting the floor so hard.
I don't know. I didn't know you would be going into this room.
Mary shook her head in denial, stepping back as John murmured.
We have no choice but to call an ambulance and the police.
At those words, Mary collapsed to the ground in despair. I immediately called for an ambulance and the police, then checked on Daniel. He was sitting on the floor, clutching his leg, struggling to breathe, his face flushed with anger. He responded to my questions, but his angry eyes were fixed on Mary the entire time. Eventually, the ambulance arrived, and I went to the hospital with my son, Daniel. After the examination, it turned out Daniel had fractured his leg and needed to be hospitalized. By the time we got to the hospital, his leg was swollen and had turned blue-black. It was a terrible sight. When I explained the situation, the nurses and doctor frowned and advised me to report to the police. I told them I had already done so and stepped out to contact my husband, John. John told me over the phone that the police had arrived and were currently taking his statement. Then the phone was handed to a police officer, who said they wanted to hear the full story later, and I agreed. According to John, Mary was just sitting on the floor, not responding to anyone during this time. I hung up and went back to Daniel's hospital room to get briefed on the hospitalization and then headed home to grab necessary items. When I returned home, there was a crowd around, making it difficult to enter. As soon as I managed to get inside, Mary started lashing out.
Why not you? Why did Daniel have to go into that room? If you had gone in, Daniel wouldn't have ended up like this.
She broke free from the police's restraint and lunged at me.
It should have been you, considering you're closer to the end of your life. If you had fallen, this house and land would have been mine soon.
Mary, spewing venom with a ferocity as if she was about to bite, was pulled away by John and the police. Yet, she still hurled insults at me and, seizing any opportunity, continued to lash out, trying to grab me again. Finally, Mary was arrested. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, she stopped speaking altogether and was led out of the house by the police. As she was put into the patrol car, many onlookers gathered, watching her being taken away. John and I were left standing, dumbfounded, watching the whole scenario unfold. After being addressed by the police, I snapped back to reality and complied briefly with their questioning before heading back to the hospital with the necessities for my son's admission. By the time I returned to the hospital room, neither the nurses nor the doctors were present. When I told Daniel about what had happened at home, he began to make a loud fuss despite his serious injuries, so much so that a nurse rushed in to help me calm him down.
I always thought there was something off about her. I didn't like the way she sometimes looked at you, Mom. I've been meaning to say something.
Despite his claim of having felt this way for a while, I had never noticed any signs from my son, nor did he seem aware of it. Instead, he seemed eager to avoid any trouble, actively trying to remove himself from any problematic situations. My son has always been like this, saying whatever is convenient to get through the moment. Likely, this time is no different. I was utterly exasperated. "Hey, Mom, there's something I've been thinking about for a while now." He suddenly lowered his voice after his previous outburst. When I asked what it was, he said, "I'm thinking of breaking up with Mary." I was taken aback, but considering her behavior, it wasn't entirely surprising. I didn't know how Mary acted when they were alone, but her behavior when visiting us was appalling. She believes that she deserves special treatment, that it is only natural for her to be pampered, and that helping out is absolutely out of the question. She was behaving as if we owed her and Daniel not just kindness but financial support, and throwing tantrums if things didn't go her way. She looked down on anything and anyone that didn't align with her values, and it was clear from her attitude that she felt superior. We, of course, disliked her for this behavior. But I had never thought about pushing my son towards divorce. I had never asked Daniel what he thought about Mary, feeling it wasn't my place. Initially, my husband and I agreed it's odd for parents to interfere in their adult son's marriage. So if Daniel said nothing, we decided to stay silent. But now, Daniel is bringing up divorce. I was left speechless.
Because she's always harsh to you, Mom, and has had a bad attitude towards Dad for so long. I just can't take it anymore.
I felt a sense of unease hearing this. Mary has never held back with me, clearly despising me. Probably she behaves the same when alone with Daniel. Yet, she's non-responsive towards John. He's a kind man but not much of a talker and looks intimidating. That might be why I've rarely seen them converse since Mary married into our family. That's why I felt uneasy when Mary panicked at John's question about the golf balls. She usually responds coldly, but her raised voice was unusual. She must have been scared of being seen through by John.
If we divorce, would I have to pay something? But then there are hospital bills too. So Mom, would you help me out?
That's when it hit me. Daniel has been trying to sound considerate to get to this point. Sadly, Daniel is my own flesh and blood. Can tell what he's thinking by looking at his face and gestures. He's been dear to me since he was a child, leading me to meddle too much, but since hitting puberty, he's found me annoying. Daniel dislikes us just like Mary does, but he's pretending to be a good son just for the money. Hey, Daniel.
What happened to the money for the car you said you were going to replace?
He had approached me for money recently when Mary and John were not around. He was saying he was planning to buy a new car and needed help because it was expensive. Obviously, he wouldn't discuss this in front of John as it was clear he would oppose. It seemed like a secret between us, so I gave him the full amount, but the car he arrived in this time was the same as the last.
That's because I haven't bought it yet. Then you should have enough to cover the hospital bills. You might not cover the alimony, but it should help somewhat. But then, the car! You can save up again once your injuries heal. We have our own lives to manage. You're old enough now, it's time you handled some things on your own. Damn it!
Disgusted that he was still trying to leech off us, I left the hospital after that. In truth, I knew that my son was squandering the money I gave him. Mary was the one who told me about it, but of course, she was also taking advantage of that situation. Despite my concerns and constant care after he left home, it seems to have backfired. This incident has given me a good opportunity to address the situation, so I went home and told John everything. After hearing everything, John said, I figured as much. I've been meaning to tell you, but he was fired from his job recently and seems to have racked up quite a debt. This was news to me, but John seemed equally surprised, having heard it during a car ride. There was nothing left to say to our son at this point. After discussing with John, we decided to disown Daniel. Some time has passed since then. Mary was sentenced to prison after a trial. Before the trial began, it seems she divorced Daniel. However, I heard that the divorce was initiated by Mary, not Daniel. It appears she initially enjoyed the money she finagled from me with Daniel, but as he gradually reduced her share and eventually stopped giving her any. That's why she concocted that scheme in my room to ensure money would come her way. What a frightening thought. Daniel seemed to cling to Mary when she proposed the divorce, but he eventually agreed. He didn't have to pay much, but he's now drowning in the debt he accumulated himself. The money for the car, which had vanished into gambling long ago, meant we had to cover his hospital bills, and now he's working hard to pay off his other debts. It's a shame things turned out this way, but it's the result of his continued dependence, and I hope he learns from this. As for my husband and me, the money we had been giving to Daniel was actually provided by John. I didn't have that kind of money, and John, fond of his son, wanted it to seem like it came from me. But now that's over, and we're planning a trip we never got around to before, discussing where to go with excitement. While I do feel a bit of regret for Daniel's situation, considering everything, I've decided it can't be helped. Now, browsing travel magazines with John has become our happiest time.
Welcome, my slave.
Despite knowing I was here for a marriage introduction, this was the first thing said to me.
Huh?
I thought I misheard and let out a confused voice. My mother-in-law chuckled as she looked at me.
Oh? Weren't you a slave? With such a meager face.
And Dan, whom I thought was on my side, betrayed me in the worst way. Glancing at my face, Dan burst into laughter.
Looks poor, doesn't she? I'd love to see what her parents look like.
Really?
Well, coming to a wealthy family like ours, I wonder if her parents would faint.
Dan and my mother-in-law continued to look down on me. Being looked down upon even by my parents, I couldn't stand it any longer. I quietly sent a message to my father when Dan and my mother-in-law weren't looking. My father replied immediately.
I'm heading there right now. I'm going to get some fresh air outside.
I couldn't bear to listen to Dan and the others' insults any longer. Don't you run away. Dan's vulgar laughter echoed. I also left my seat to wait for my father's arrival. 10 minutes later, I introduced my father to Dan and the others.
Here's the father of the slave.
My father's voice was calm, but his eyes were not smiling at all.
Huh?
Knowing my father's face, my mother-in-law's face stiffened greatly. I am Emily. I turned 30 this year. I work at a small company called Smith Machinery and have lived as inconspicuous as possible. That's why my usual makeup is just foundation. I also favored wearing navy and black clothes. I don't wear contacts and wear thick glasses due to my high prescription. The reason I go to such lengths is because my father has a certain job, and I've been affected by it since I was young. My father works as an actor. He used to be quite popular, apparently getting surrounded by women whenever he walked through town. Though he often plays supporting roles, he appears on TV quite often and is somewhat recognized by the public. I had a hard time because of my father until middle school. My friends would ask for my father, and their parents would say, "Let us meet him." Rejecting all these requests, I was often criticized by those around me. I must have seemed selfish to them. I even faced harassment from jealous classmates. I didn't want to cause trouble for my father, whom I love. I also hated the idea of being thought of as showing off. Struggling with these thoughts, I decided to dress as plainly as possible and went to a high school where nobody knew me. Fortunately, Smith was a common last name, so I could live normally from high school onwards. And maybe because of my plain appearance, guys didn't approach me. Thus, I was able to enjoy a comfortable school life. I loved talking with my girlfriends. Those times were probably the happiest for me. I met my fiancé, Dan, after becoming a working adult. Dan worked for the leasing company that provided the printers my company uses. Dan and I had little direct interaction. He would regularly check on the printer, and we would exchange a few words then. Our relationship changed significantly when the printer broke down one day. That day, I was busy preparing materials for a meeting happening the next day. However, the printer stopped working midway. I was in a bind. If this continued, I wouldn't be able to prepare the materials for tomorrow's meeting. In a panic, I called Dan. Dan came right away to check on the printer. "Can you fix it?" When I asked Dan anxiously, he answered with a smile.
Don't worry. I'll take care of it.
I fell in love with Dan's smile in an instant. As for what happened next, it couldn't be fixed in the end, but Dan arranged for a replacement. We managed to prepare the materials in time for the meeting. Smitten by Dan, I tried my best to appeal to him. I asked for his contact and made frequent calls. And then, I confessed to Dan and we started dating. Dan was really kind even after we started dating. He was always considerate and I had never seen him angry. I thought that even if he knew the real identity of my father, he would continue to treat me kindly. Thinking this, I boldly proposed to Dan after 3 months of dating. He happily accepted. I remember being very happy. However, there was one thing that bothered me. It was my appearance. I always wore thick glasses. I dressed plainly even on dates. It was a habit I couldn't break. Originally, I looked just like my father. I have a distinct appearance. Because of my looks, I was envied by girls during my teenage. I also had a hard time being judged by boys based on my appearance. But with Dan, I thought everything would be okay. From now on, I thought I would gradually change my appearance for Dan, whom I love so much. However, after getting engaged to Dan, I started feeling uneasy more frequently. Before our engagement, Dan seemed like a kind person, but recently, he started making belittling comments towards me. The other day, we went to a bridal fair to decide on a wedding venue. Because Dan had suggested we go. The place Dan took me was a dazzling world. It was a luxurious guest house, perfect for a grand wedding with over 100 guests. Seeing that scene, I felt confused. I didn't have many friends from my school days. Moreover, I didn't want to stand out, so I had hoped for a small venue with just the ceremony. I really wanted to leave immediately. However, Dan seemed to be having fun, so I couldn't bring it up. Therefore, I endured and passed the time. When it was all over, and we stopped by a cafe, Dan was in a great mood. The wedding venue we saw earlier was nice, wasn't it? I personally would prefer an even more extravagant ceremony, Dan said while drinking his coffee. At this rate, it would end up being the wedding venue we saw earlier. Panicked, I decided to discuss my preferences with Dan. I think a small wedding would be nice. I don't really like standing out, I said, hoping the kind Dan would make concessions. But the reality was completely different. Dan looked at me and laughed through his nose. Sure, for a plain Jane like Emily, a wedding like the one we saw wouldn't suit her. In fact, there isn't a dress that would suit those thick glasses, right? Huh? I was puzzled by Dan's comment. My family is wealthy, so we have to have a certain level of wedding to save face. I was speechless. Dan, who had always been kind, was suddenly looking down on me. I was deeply shocked by Dan's attitude. And then, to my confused self, Dan made an even worse comment. Emily should just stay quiet and listen to what I say. A plain Jane like you should be grateful she can get married at all. Suddenly, Dan's face turned serious as he made that comment. I was bewildered by his words. I even felt fear towards Dan's demeanor. Then, in the next moment, Dan smiled and said, I'll make all the decisions. Emily just needs to say yes and follow my lead. Yes. Not knowing how to respond, I smiled awkwardly. Maybe getting engaged to Dan was a mistake. But it's too late to act as if it never happened. I've already announced our marriage to the company and our parents. And despite everything, I still loved Dan. Maybe one day, he would return to the kind Dan I knew before the engagement. So, even though I was confused by Dan's changes, I had no choice but to continue with the engagement. Dan continued to make comments that troubled me. Each time, my heart was hurt. But I couldn't bring myself to dislike Dan. Even though I thought about breaking up with Dan, the kind Dan I knew before would flash through my mind. I still loved Dan. Despite being confused by Dan's changes, I continued with our engagement relationship. And then one day, an event occurred that left me even more bewildered. It happened on the day Dan and I were finalizing the arrangements at the wedding venue. After touring several venues, Dan decided on the first luxurious guest house we visited. Proudly, Dan said, A lavish ceremony really suits me. Though, it's mismatched for Emily. Dan laughed heartily, hurting me in the process. And so, we went to that guest house for the wedding venue paperwork. On our way there, I encountered a certain person. Dan! Mom, what are you doing here? Dan was surprised to see the woman. Then, he introduced her to me. Emily, this is my mom. Mom, this is Emily, my fiancée. I told you we were getting married, right? His mother greeted me with a smile. I'm Dan's mother. You seem like a serious young lady. Where do you work? Surely at a major corporation, right? This was my first meeting with Dan's mother. I answered nervously. I work in administration at Smith Machinery. His mother looked puzzled. Smith Machinery? Never heard of it. Then Dan joined in our conversation. Smith Machinery is one of my sales destinations. It's a small company with about 30 employees, so it's natural you haven't heard of it, Mom. Upon hearing Dan's explanation, his mother frowned. I thought being Dan's fiancée, you'd work at a more reputable company. Isn't your salary quite low then? Are you planning to make Dan struggle? I'm sorry. Indeed, my salary at the current company isn't very high. That's all I could do, apologize to his mother. Then, his mother sighed heavily and said, Anyway,
Can you stop being a burden on Dan's back? Our family comes from a distinguished lineage. We don't need a woman of unknown background.
Huh. I gave a non-committal reply to his mother's statement, but she continued to escalate.
What about your parents? They work at reputable companies, right?
His mother glared at me, demanding an answer.
My father is.
As I was confusedly trying to answer, my gaze drifted to his mother's purse. Because I saw something familiar. Seeing me silent, Dan spoke up.
Mom, calm down. We'll come for a visit later.
Fine.
But don't expect a warm welcome.
His mother glared at me with a displeased face. My first impression seemed to be the worst for his mother. The road to marriage seemed too steep, and I quietly sighed. And so, the day of the visit arrived.
Wow!
Standing in front of Dan's family home, I couldn't help but mutter. The scene before me far exceeded my expectations. Since his mother mentioned a distinguished lineage, I expected Dan's family to be wealthy. However, the sight before me was beyond imagination. The gate had automatic doors, and there was an elevator inside. Moreover, there were 10 luxury cars outside. All were foreign cars, probably his father's hobby. Dan spoke to me.
Today, my dad is at work. It's just my mom, so relax like usual.
Dan said with a smile, but my face grew even stiffer. His mother had been harsh to me previously. Surely, she would make some unpleasant comments today as well. And so, Dan and I entered the living room where his mother was waiting. Hello. Thank you for the other day. Then, in the next moment, his mother said something unbelievable.
Welcome, my slave.
Despite knowing I was here, this was the first thing she said.
Huh?
I thought I misheard and voiced my confusion. His mother chuckled as she looked at me.
Oh? Weren't you a slave? With such a meager face. I just wanted someone I could use for free. To be called a slave.
What a terrible thing to say. Then, his mother laughed as if she was enjoying herself.
Dan told me. He said it's okay to treat you like a slave. It seems Dan just wanted to marry someone he could dominate. My condolences. Dan, what's this all about?
I asked Dan, pale-faced. It must be some kind of bad joke. I wanted to believe that. And then, Dan, whom I thought was on my side, betrayed me in the worst way. Glancing at my face, Dan burst out laughing.
Looks poor, doesn't she? I'd love to see what her parents look like. They probably have plain faces too. Maybe we can use her parents as well?
Dan said, laughing uproariously.
Indeed, having someone obedient for free is attractive. But, coming to a wealthy family like ours, I wonder if her parents would faint.
Dan and his mother continued to look down on me. And then his mother asked with a smirk.
By the way, what does your father do for a living?
He isn't homeless, is he?
No way!
Dan replied, bursting into laughter.
Mom, that's not a job. Given Emily's situation, it's certain he doesn't have a stable job. I'm laughing so hard my stomach hurts.
Dan and his mother continued to look down on my parents. They assumed they had low education or plain looks. I was so frustrated, clenching my teeth listening to their comments. They were too rude to my parents and me. I couldn't stand it anymore. I quietly sent a message to my father when Dan and his mother weren't looking. I need you to come now. I sent him the map of Dan's family home along with the message. The map was given to me by Dan for today's visit. Today was supposed to be my father's day off. He must be relaxing at home by now. Luckily, my father replied within a minute.
I'm on my way.
Seeing my father's message, I felt relieved. Then, I excused myself to Dan and his mother.
I'm feeling a bit unwell, so I'll get some fresh air outside.
I couldn't bear to listen to Dan and the others' insults any longer. I decided to wait outside quietly until my father arrived.
Oh, is that so?
Then, Dan, let's continue our coffee leisurely. His mother was pleased to be alone with Dan.
Emily, don't you run away.
Dan's vulgar laughter echoed. I left the seat and waited for my father's arrival. 10 minutes later. My father appeared, wearing dark sunglasses.
Emily, what's the matter? Today was supposed to be the day you visit your fiancé's family, wasn't it? I was surprised when you suddenly called.
My father asked me with a puzzled look. Dad, I'm so frustrated. Seeing my father's face, I felt relieved and started to cry. I couldn't stop the tears from flowing.
What happened, Emily?
My father started to panic seeing me cry. I explained everything to my father. How Dan's attitude changed after our engagement. And how he and his mother looked down on me together.
I can't stand them looking down on you without knowing anything.
I couldn't stop crying as I explained. My father listened silently to my story. But he seemed quietly angry. Then I told my father about something his mother said. At that moment, my father smirked. He took off his sunglasses and handed them to me.
We're going inside now. We'll make sure they regret hurting Emily.
I made up my mind at my father's words. My love for Dan had cooled. All that was left was a desire for revenge. I've made up my mind too. We'll make Dan and his family regret this. After doing something, I put on my father's sunglasses. Then, together with my father, we entered Dan's family home. I stood before Dan and his family with my father.
We've kept you waiting.
Standing resolutely with my father. Dan was dumbfounded to see me wearing sunglasses.
Why are you suddenly wearing sunglasses?
Dan looked at me and muttered. Initially, his mother smirked at me, but upon seeing my father beside me, she was stunned into silence. I realized that people really do freeze up from shock. She must have been planning to make more terrible comments upon my return. But unfortunately for her, I won't let things go her way. Instead, I plan to push her to the abyss. She probably already knows who my father is. Then, my father spoke to her.
I'm the father of the so-called slave.
His voice was calm, but his eyes were not smiling. With my father's handsome face, his presence became even more intimidating.
Huh?
His mother, likely knowing my father's face, froze up dramatically.
Why? Why is Tim here? No, is this some kind of prank?
She uttered, visibly shaken. Her cheeks were slightly reddened. And there was a somewhat delighted air about her. Her eyes sparkled, almost like those of a young girl. Dan, not understanding the situation, remained stunned. Without answering his mother's question, my father just stared at Dan and his mother. His mother blushed under his gaze. It's embarrassing to see a grown woman act like this. I looked at his mother with a cold gaze. Then, Dan, regaining his composure, asked curiously.
Tim? Mom, do you know this person?
Dan probably doesn't know about my father. I'd guess he's quite well known among his mother's generation. But younger people might not know unless they watched dramas. Then, his mother glared sharply at Dan.
Dan! How can you say such disrespectful things? This man is Tim. A leading actor and my first love.
Huh? Dan seemed incredulous. Then, his mother turned to my father with a smile and spoke.
I'm a big fan of Tim. Look, this too.
She quickly fetched her purse and showed it to my father.
It's a keychain available exclusively to members. I've been a fan of Tim for over 20 years.
His mother started to show off her fandom. Mom. Dan seemed appalled by his mother's sudden change. She continued to talk to my father, clearly thrilled to have her favorite actor in front of her. However, my father's gaze on his mother was stern. Finally, breaking his silence, my father spoke.
I understand you're a fan of mine, but you were trying to treat my dear daughter Emily as a slave, weren't you?
Huh? His mother's enthusiasm vanished, and she turned pale, visibly trembling. Ignoring his mother's panic, my father continued.
And, without even meeting me, you assumed I was homeless? Quite a disrespectful assumption.
With that, my father glared at his mother. She started to unravel.
No! I didn't know Emily's father was Tim. Having Tim as a family member is more than welcome. Right, Dan?
Yeah. Dan seemed pressured by his mother. And she hastily tried to explain herself to my father. I was astounded by her words. His mother had been looking down on me and my father until she saw him. Then, she completely changed her tune. I couldn't trust her at all.
Upon closer inspection, Emily is very much like Tim, a truly lovely young lady. My earlier comments were just out of jealousy, thinking my son was taken away. Had I known it was Tim, I would have been more respectful.
She desperately tried to mend the situation. My father looked annoyed by his mother. Watching their exchange, I thought, I can't let my father be troubled any further. And this is my problem. I should clearly state my position to his mother. So, I told his mother,
I'm breaking off my engagement with Dan. There's no chance of us becoming family with Tim. No! Emily, I was wrong. We could have become family with Tim. Please reconsider.
His mother, with tears welling up in her eyes, tried to persuade me. She had been awful to me before. Even with tears in her eyes, I couldn't trust her. I looked at her with a cold gaze. Yet, seeing me silent, she seemed to think she could somehow persuade me. She smiled warmly at me.
Emily, you want to marry Dan, right? I won't oppose it anymore, it's okay. I'll do anything for you.
She clung to me, desperate to become family with my father. Saying she'd do anything is the complete opposite of her initial attitude. I felt contempt for her fickleness. I muttered softly, I don't want to.
What did you say?
She tilted her head, not catching my words. So, I shouted louder this time.
I absolutely do not want to become family with you. What?
She was taken aback by my outcry. I unleashed all my feelings towards her.
You started making derogatory comments the moment you heard where I work, and even spoke terribly about my father. I can never forgive that.
I made it clear to her.
Huh?
Realizing she couldn't persuade me any further, she turned to my father. Then, smiling at my father, she spoke.
Emily might say this, but Tim, you want your daughter to be happy, right? Our family has a lot of money, she'll surely be happy with us. There might be people who think money equals happiness. But I'm not one of them.
My father countered her words, understanding my feelings.
Emily values love more than money. Besides, we have enough money. I make a decent amount from acting.
She was at a loss for words. It's no surprise. After all, my father is a famous actor who appears frequently on TV. He earns a lot and we're not struggling for money. There's no merit for me to marry just for financial reasons, considering my family's wealth. Realizing this, she fell silent. Probably unable to think of a good counter-argument. Seeing her silent, my father continued.
You say you're a fan of mine. But I hate people who disregard my precious daughter. Could you please stop calling yourself a fan?
With that, my father glared at her. Then, tears started streaming down her face.
If Tim hates me, I can't go on living.
She broke down crying. Dan, who had been silent until now, began to speak.
Keep quiet and you can say whatever you want, huh? Emily, you'll regret breaking off our engagement. No one else will want a plain Jane like you.
Dan smirked.
Hey, Dan!
His mother tried to stop him, in front of my father. But Dan didn't stop.
I chose you because I thought you'd be submissive. I planned to cheat with cute girls once we were married. This is really annoying.
He blabbered about things I didn't even want to hear. Hearing Dan's words, I thought calmly. There was never any love from Dan. He just wanted a convenient woman to marry. My feelings for Dan had long since cooled. While I was pondering this, Dan continued with his selfish remarks.
Hey!
My father was grinding his teeth, looking like he was about to grab Dan any moment. It was probably time for me to retaliate.
Wait, Dad.
I stopped my father. Still wearing sunglasses, I let out a slight smile.
What's up?
Dan seemed a bit taken aback by my composed smile.
Is this plain enough for you?
I quickly took off the sunglasses I had been wearing.
What?
Dan stared at my face, frozen. And no wonder. After taking off the sunglasses, I was fully made up. Normally, I only wear foundation. But now, I had on eyeshadow, mascara, and eyeliner. After greeting my father and crying, I immediately did my makeup. Just eye makeup, but it significantly changed my appearance.
Is that really you, Emily?
Dan's face turned a bit red. He was probably mesmerized by my makeup-enhanced appearance. Yes, of course, it's me.
I used to downplay my looks to avoid standing out. But I've stopped hiding myself.
I had always stood out involuntarily because of my father. So, I had been modest until now. But because of that, Dan and his mother spoke ill of my father. If being spoken ill of by them meant I had to stand out a bit, then I decided it was better to be myself. With his face turning red, Dan said,
"If you had shown up like this from the start, I would have treated you kindly. With you looking like this after makeup, I'm willing to start over. Let's cancel the engagement. And while you're at it, introduce me to some beautiful actresses through your father."
Who would cancel the engagement cancellation now? And asking to be introduced to actresses is too brazen. I firmly told Dan.
The engagement cancellation is final. I don't need someone like Dan anymore. I'll cancel the wedding venue too.
Huh? Dan was dumbfounded. But I wasn't about to let him off that easily. I went on to corner Dan further.
Of course, Dan will be responsible for the cancellation fee of the wedding venue. That's only fair, right?
His mother let out a bewildered sound.
Wait a minute! It's too much to bear the whole cost.
Dan looked confused and couldn't argue back. Then, my father spoke up.
Why not have Dan's father cover it? With all those luxury cars he has, that should be easy, right?
My father said, smiling amiably. Here, I played my trump card.
If you're not satisfied, we can go to court. But remember, my father is a famous actor. Extreme fans who hear about this through the news might retaliate against you.
My father has many enthusiastic fans. A critic who once called my father a wooden actor suffered terribly. Harassment calls and letters with blades, the extent of the damage was unimaginable. It even made the news at one point. His mother, remembering that incident, turned pale. She was urgently persuading Dan.
Dan has to bear the whole cancellation fee. Who knows what might happen?
From his mother's expression, Dan seemed to understand the gravity of the situation.
Huh? You're kidding.
Dan's face fell, and he slumped to his knees. Dan is unnecessary in my life.
Dad, let's go.
Ignoring the downtrodden Dan and his mother, I left with my father. Emily and Dan ended up going through with the engagement cancellation. And Dan was made to bear the entire cost of the wedding venue cancellation. Actually, Dan's father is the CEO of a major company, and my father had appeared in commercials for his company. Because of that connection, my father informed Dan's father about Dan and his mother's actions. Naturally, Dan's father was furious and confronted Dan and his mother harshly. He pressured Dan into covering the entire cancellation fee. As a result, Dan had to pay several million yen. The repercussions extended to his mother. This time, his mother was faced with a divorce ultimatum from his father. Due to their treatment of us, and not just that, but also because she had been excessively wasteful. She had spent a significant amount on following my father around, using Dan's father's money. It seems Dan's father had already lost his love for her. Moreover, it was revealed that she had sent quite daring love letters to my father.
I want to divorce and be with Tim. My current husband is just a source of money.
She had written such content in a love letter to my father. Dan's father was furious at this. Despite her resistance, a divorce was finalized with the help of lawyers. "I never expected this," she reportedly cried. Additionally, she was forced to leave my father's membership. She had been quite a nuisance with her fan activities, so it was inevitable. It's hard to imagine happiness coming her way after losing everything. She got what she deserved. Half a year has passed. Incredibly, Dan was arrested. The reason was his stalking behavior towards me. He probably couldn't forget me after I took off my sunglasses that day. Dan began to appear in front of me frequently. Even after I quit my job, he started lurking in front of my home. And he called me often.
"Please, let's get engaged again. I can't do without you."
He would cry over the phone, but in the end, it seemed he was only looking at my face. The difference before and after I showed him my made-up face was stark. I didn't need a man who judged solely by appearances. I politely refused and then blocked his calls. However, Dan's behavior only escalated. I consulted the police several times. And there were times when I felt threatened by him. After much deliberation, I filed a complaint with the police. My father supported this decision. Ultimately, Dan was arrested for forcibly entering my home. And with his arrest, it seems Dan was fired from his company. Now, all that remains for Dan is a debt of several $100,000. It's likely that he won't be able to lead a decent life from now on. That's the punishment for looking down on people. What goes around comes around, I believe. Since then, I've been working as my father's manager. Unlike my previous office job, this one has its challenges. Managing my father's schedule, accompanying him on site visits, and even negotiating salaries. Before, as an office worker, my life was just a cycle between home and the company. I rarely spoke to people at work, mostly facing my computer. Now, meeting and talking to people has become the main part of my job. It's a big change from before. But now, I find it incredibly enjoyable. Being a manager is not just a glamorous job. It's about supporting my father in his acting career from behind the scenes. The hours are irregular, and adaptability is crucial. Above all, it's a job where I can support my father up close. I want to repay him for all the worry I've caused. It's a job I've just started. There will be many challenges ahead. But I want to keep moving forward with determination. I continue to strive every day by my beloved father's side.
This is the punishment for slacking off on household chores. Don't even think about taking a day off for something as trivial as a funeral.
Grinning maliciously, my son's wife, Michelle, tossed my mother's keepsake into a metal drum. As the keepsake burned and crumbled with crackling sounds inside the drum, I felt as if the ground beneath me was collapsing in despair. At the same time, anger boiled up inside me, making my body tremble. Seeing me like this, Michelle seemed to think I was just downcast and burst out laughing loudly with a mean look on her face.
"Do you even know the value of that? Huh?"
Caught off guard by my retort, Michelle let out a startled yelp. This time, I made sure to look Michelle in the eye before I spoke.
"That's worth $400,000.
Michelle's eyes widened in shock. Watching her face turn pale, I was convinced that now was my chance for revenge. My name is Nancy. I'm a 72-year-old homemaker. It's been nearly 40 years since I married Tim. My parents, worried about me never getting married, arranged a meeting with Tim, and that's how we met. Tim is a very gentle man, and contrary to my fears, there were no conflicts with his family, leading to a very smooth marriage. Our relationship has been good. It took a while for us to have children, but fortunately, we never felt pressured by those around us. Or rather, I later realized that Tim had been shielding me from the nagging relatives all that time. Knowing this made me fall in love with him even more. Our son, Simon, was born in the 4th year of our marriage. Tim was overjoyed and cried, actively participating in parenting. I still remember thinking how glad I was to have married him. Now, Simon is 36 years old. He's working hard as the next president of Tim's company. And got married 3 years ago. Michelle, Simon's wife, is a bit headstrong. She insisted on not living together when we first met, so they live in a separate house on our property. Becoming a homemaker after marriage, she would go out every day, returning with bags from high-end stores. Although I had my concerns, Tim told me that since Simon and Michelle were a separate household, we shouldn't be too nosy, so I watched over them. One day, Simon mentioned he wanted to live together, saying Michelle found the house too big to manage alone and thought living together would be better. My mother lives with us. 5 years ago, after my father passed away, Tim suggested bringing my mother to live with us. My mother, who has difficulty walking and uses a wheelchair, needs assistance. We have a helper during the day, but I mainly take care of her at night. If Simon and Michelle were to live with us, the household chores would be halved, and I thought it would be a bit easier for me. I readily agreed to live together. And Tim, seeing that I was okay with it, allowed it, so Simon and Michelle began using the previously vacant second floor. We decided to rent out the separate house to prevent it from deteriorating without an occupant. And so, the cohabitation of our family, my mother, and Simon and Michelle began. Michelle initially helped with the household chores and caregiving, but as Simon's work became busier and he started coming home late, she began making excuses to avoid helping. Instead, she even started leaving their laundry for me to do, increasing my burden. A month in, Michelle stopped helping altogether and instead began ordering me around to do this and that. If I talked back, she would complain of being ill or accuse me of bullying her, and I would end up doing the chores in defeat. Worse, when Simon was home, Michelle pretended to be busy with household chores. It became a daily occurrence for her to report to Simon that she had done the chores I had actually done when Tim and Simon were out. At times, it was as if she was portraying me as not doing any chores and pushing them onto her. In reality, it was the complete opposite. Michelle would go out as soon as Tim and Simon left for work and return just before they came home at night, acting as if she had been too busy working at home to even have time for makeup. Simon, being quite under his wife's thumb, would never suspect that Michelle was going out every day in his absence. Listening to my eldest son's wife always brings a smile to my face, she says. It's great that you're getting some relief, Mom. I couldn't help but be moved by my son's thoughtful words every time. One day, I had to go out for a doctor's appointment and couldn't arrange for a caregiver, so I asked my son's wife, Michelle, to help out. She unusually agreed to help just for the morning, after I explained it would only take about 2 hours, so I thanked her and left. However, when I returned, Michelle was nowhere to be found. Rushing to my mother's side, I found her asleep, seemingly undisturbed by my absence, which relieved me. Michelle casually returned in the evening. Unable to hold back, I confronted her.
Michelle, I specifically asked you to help out just for this morning, right? It's good nothing happened to Mom, but why did you leave?
Michelle frowned at my words. Not even trying to hide her annoyance while twirling her long hair, she retorted.
Well, she was just sleeping, right? You were coming back soon anyway, so I thought I wasn't needed. Besides, I'm busy too. I wanted to get my nails done.
Really? I was infuriated by her selfishness. But seeing my anger, Michelle just smirked and said,
Are you mad? That's fine. I'll just tell Simon you're bullying me.
Michelle's triumphant look was unbearable. But I wasn't strong enough to retort. I had no choice but to silently endure her behavior. After this incident, Michelle became even more unbearable. Then, one day, Simon, who had taken a rare day off, approached me with a serious look.
Mom, I heard from Michelle. Are you really bullying her? Me? No way, I would never do such a thing.
Although I answered immediately, Simon seemed unconvinced. Reluctantly agreeing to sit down and talk, Simon finally joined me at the table.
So, Michelle told you that I've been bullying her? I inquired. Yes. I know you're not the type to do such things, but Michelle was crying. If it's true, I have to support my wife. Dad always said to put your wife first after marriage.
That's exactly what Tim had always said. to prioritize the wife over everyone else, and to trust her first and foremost. While I was glad Simon had grown into such a considerate person, I was also furious at Michelle for deceiving him.
Is there any proof that I've been bullying her? No, just what Michelle told me.
I sighed, knowing it would come to this.
Of course, there's no evidence. Just like Michelle doesn't have proof that I bullied her, I don't have proof that I didn't.
I see. Simon nodded, before standing up and leaving, hinting he might want to talk about this again. That night, I told Tim everything that had happened. After sharing Michelle's recent actions, Tim thought for a moment before making a phone call. He then asked me to keep track of the times Michelle went out. Starting the next day, I followed Tim's instructions and began logging Michelle's outings. Additionally, Tim secretly installed surveillance cameras to gather evidence of her outings. Michelle continued her routine of leaving the house as soon as Tim and Simon went to work. Gradually, she began referring to me as the maid. I was seething with anger but held back as Tim advised patience. Without a word of complaint, I continued to obey, even as Michelle began ordering me to clean their living area. While doing laundry, I stumbled upon shocking evidence.
Can't believe this!
I took photos, carefully replaced everything, and began compiling evidence to eventually confront Simon. Just as we were planning to discuss everything with Simon on his next day off, my mother fell critically ill and was rushed to the hospital. We tried calling Michelle, who was notoriously hard to wake once asleep, but couldn't reach her. Simon had always mentioned how difficult it was to wake Michelle, but Tim and I knew the real reason she wouldn't answer. Thanks to the doctor's efforts, my mother held on until morning but passed away before noon. I cried uncontrollably, and Tim comforted me throughout.
Michelle got in touch. She's waiting at home,
Simon said as he returned to the hospital room and held my mother's hand, crying. After discussing arrangements, we went back home to meet Michelle.
What's that?
Tim asked as he noticed smoke coming from our yard while driving. Is this a fire at a time like this? Panicked, I rushed inside alone, only to find Michelle, my son's wife, throwing things into a drum can in the yard.
What are you doing?
She turned around at my voice. In her right hand was a can of beer, and in her left, something familiar that made my blood run cold.
What are you planning to do with that?
It was an old book, a keepsake from my mother. She had collected them as a hobby, dedicating one wall of her room to a bookshelf where they were stored. Next to Michelle, a pile of old books was haphazardly stacked. Michelle, clearly drunk and in high spirits, said,
Well, Grandma's gone now, so we're not using that room, right?
So, I'm cleaning it up for you.
I'm taking that room.
As she said this, she threw the books into the drum can, one after another. I was so shocked I couldn't move, barely managing to utter a weak stop.
First of all, for a servant, you didn't prepare breakfast, the bath wasn't ready, and the laundry wasn't done. Can't believe you slacked off housework just because Grandma was at her peak. I was really troubled.
Apologize to me.
Okay, I'm sorry, please, those books are important. Don't burn them.
Protecting my mother's books was my top priority. I repeated insincere apologies while begging Michelle to stop. However, Michelle looked at me satisfied and burned another book.
This is what you get for slacking off on housework for something like a funeral.
Grinning, Michelle continued to throw my mother's keepsakes into the drum can. Watching the keepsakes burn and crumble inside the can, I felt a crushing sense of despair and my body trembled with a bubbling anger. Seeing me like this, Michelle, thinking I was just down, laughed out loud with a nasty look on her face.
Do you know the value of those? What?
Not expecting me to talk back, Michelle exclaimed in a flustered voice. This time, I locked eyes with Michelle and spoke clearly.
That's worth $400,000.
Michelle's eyes widened in shock. Seeing her face turn pale, I knew now was my chance for revenge.
Hey! What are you doing?
My husband and Simon, having followed me, restrained a stunned Michelle and doused the drum can with water. About half of the old books were saved, but it seemed most had turned to ash in the can, and my husband shook his head at me. Unable to move from the shock, my husband led me back to our room. "Wait here for a bit," he said, returning with the remaining old books from the garden.
"Simon is talking to Michelle right now, so you'll be called soon. Are you okay? I know you're not, so don't push yourself. I'll be your side."
My husband reassured me, making me cry again. Shortly after, there was a knock at the door, and Simon entered the room. The stress of his grandmother's passing and his wife's bizarre behavior had taken its toll on him. Michelle was apparently in the living room.
"Mom, I'm really sorry. I talked to Michelle, but what she's saying is all over the place. Let's talk with everyone. Can we call a lawyer, please?"
"All right," my husband replied. Contacting a lawyer who would arrive in about 15 minutes, so we decided to start the discussion. Moving to the living room, Michelle glared at me without hiding her displeasure. Simon tried to calm her, but she burst into tears, screaming, "You always take your parents' side." The discussion seemed impossible with her attitude. However, my husband began calmly.
"Let's hear your reasoning for this. Your mom said before. Those books are in the way, so once Grandma's gone, you can throw them away. Why are you getting mad now?"
Michelle cried out her defense, to which my husband looked exasperated. When she realized her crying tactic wasn't working, Michelle stopped and began a different claim.
"I was always mistreated by your mom, just wanted to get back at her." "Oh? And what kind of mistreatment did my wife do?"
Challenged by my husband's calm inquiry, Michelle hesitated for a moment but then started listing accusations against me.
"Being forced to do all the housework, receiving snide remarks whenever I wanted to go out. And I was the one doing most of the caregiving. And I wasn't even allowed to be there for Grandma's last moment. I got a message saying don't come."
I was almost impressed by how she could pile on so many lies. My husband was nodding along as he listened, but as soon as Michelle finished speaking, he laid out some documents on the table. These were detailed records of the antique books, each with its price listed.
"What's this?" "I hadn't mentioned it before because you seemed uninterested in books, but those antiques are extremely valuable. My wife and I spent years collecting them for Nancy's mother. There's no way she would have said it's okay to dispose of them. The total collection is worth about $800,000, and you've burned about half, so that's at least $400,000.
Can you afford to pay that?" Michelle turned pale upon hearing this. She obviously hadn't taken my words seriously. Unable to believe that those old, brown books could be worth so much.
"Well, Dad, Mom, I'm so sorry. We should have just enough in our savings. Not that it makes it okay."
Besides Simon, Michelle's face went from pale to white. Simon might have seen it as remorse, but my husband and I sensed something else.
"Michelle, you've been dipping into the savings, haven't you? There's none left, right?" "How do you know that?"
Caught red-handed, Michelle let the truth slip. Simon was shocked, staring at her in disbelief. The reason we knew? The lawyer had brought additional documents.
"I figured as much. You've been accusing me of bullying you to Simon, but in reality, you were the bully. Calling me a servant and dumping all the housework on me. Look at this. It's a record of all the times you went out."
Simon trembled as he read through the evidence. His trust in his wife shattered. Meanwhile, Michelle tried to dismiss the documents as fabrications.
"Seems like you have quite a lot of free time on your hands. Making up such fake documents is just awful." "Really? Then how do you explain these security camera footage?"
I pointed out, leaving her no room to argue. Michelle turned to Simon, pleading in a sweet, remorseful tone.
"Simon, I'm sorry. I was just lonely without you. I went out to see friends and shop. I won't do it again. Please forgive me."
"Friends, huh?" my husband remarked skeptically. And Michelle realized we knew her deepest secret. Panicking, she tried to wrap up the conversation.
Anyway, I'm really sorry for everything. I'll get a job and pay back the $400,000, okay? This is over now, right, Simon?
Simon, confused by her haste, didn't know what to make of it. But seizing the moment, the lawyer and we laid out irrefutable evidence on the table.
What's this, Michelle?
Simon demanded, his voice rising. Michelle desperately tried to convince Simon that it was all a misunderstanding, attempting to divert his attention away from the documents. However, Simon brushed her aside and proceeded to scrutinize the papers. The documents revealed Michelle's affair with her ex-boyfriend from school days. In fact, investigations showed she never broke up with him. He was unemployed, living in a hotel on Michelle's dime, seeing Simon as nothing but a cash cow.
So, you've been betraying me from the start. It's not true. It's all made up. I love you, believe me.
Michelle desperately tried to convince him, but we were beyond disgusted.
These documents are from a detective I hired. They're reliable,
Simon said, as Michelle slumped to the floor in defeat. Simon, unable to bear staying any longer, started to leave. Michelle, in a last-ditch effort, called out to him.
Hey, Simon! Hang on! I don't want to see your face again. We'll go through lawyers from now on.
As Simon left, Michelle reached out to him in vain. My husband and I left the matter to the lawyer and consoled our disheartened son, discussing what would come next. Soon after, Simon had Michelle evicted, leading to a scene and her eventual arrest. A restraining order was issued, and legal actions were taken against her and her lover. They demanded compensation for the money spent during hotel stays, on top of the usual damages. Surprisingly, Michelle's lover, who had other sugar daddies, paid the entire amount in one go. Rumor has it that because of this, another of his benefactors found out about the affair with Michelle, and now he's been forced into non-stop physical labor until he earns back what he paid to Simon. After being dumped by her lover, Michelle has been juggling part-time jobs to pay Simon and me the ordered alimony. Though we receive a set amount each month, it will likely take longer than it takes a child to reach adulthood to fully settle the debt. My husband retired, passing the company to Simon to bolster his spirits. Perhaps there are things that men can understand among themselves. Simon has been dedicating himself to his work and, bit by bit, seems to be regaining his spirits. Later, when Michelle tried to reconcile, Simon refused her outright, maintaining the restraining order. However, Simon firmly refused her. Without even seeing her face, he reportedly responded over the intercom, "You know there's a restraining order, right? I'll call the police." Eventually, Michelle was escorted out by the security guards. We fulfilled our dream of building a home in the countryside and converting our old house into a popular share house, securing a comfortable retirement. With Simon moving to a different apartment, we decided to renovate our original home into a trendy shared house. Thanks to its prime location, we were immediately flooded with applicants. Between this passive income and our savings, it looks like we won't have to worry about money in our retirement. 3 years post-divorce, Simon mentioned a woman he'd like us to meet, a coworker who had been by his side. My husband approved, saying she was trustworthy. We looked forward to their visit, hopeful for Simon's new chapter.
I need all of this gone.
Thrown into the coffin where my second son lay were several photographs. Picking up the items that weren't there before, I first noticed the words "Scene of Infidelity" and then, on the back of the photos, there were dates and unfamiliar names written. I turned back to the person who had thrown them in. Crossing her arms and wearing a nasty smile, my first son's wife looked at me. I was so shocked I couldn't close my mouth, just sweating coldly and staring back at her. It was almost time for the coffin to leave. But before that, this truth had to be exposed. I hurried off to the police. My name is Margaret Johnson. I turned 83 this year. I got married when I was young, and not long after, we were blessed with a baby boy, Michael. My first son was so lively, growing up right before my eyes. And when he begged for a little brother, that's when my second son, John, was born. Unlike his energetic brother, he was calm and easy to care for. Their personalities became clear as day. My first son would run around whenever he had the chance, while my second son spent his time reading picture books and drawing. That didn't change whether they were in elementary or middle school, and eventually, they went to different high schools. Then, my first son chose to work right after high school, while my second son went to college. My first son hopped from job to job, while my second son got a job at the city hall. After a while, my first son got married, but my second son is still single to this day. My second son had always been shy and asthmatic since he was little, so he was modest in everything he did. Despite this, my first son always wanted to take him out to play. That didn't change even when they grew up. At the end of the year, my second son came home for the holidays. As always, he brought a gift and greeted me with a cheerful "I'm home." I took his luggage and invited him in, then he went off to change in his old room, saying he'd be right back. I still keep my son's rooms just as they were. They both come home for Thanksgiving and Christmas every year, and since my first son's room is a bit larger, his wife can stay there too, so I don't need to prepare a new room. That's why I occasionally take the time to clean their rooms. It's one of the joys of my retirement. The day after my second son arrived, my first son and his wife also came home. My house suddenly became lively and filled with warmth. It's a happy time for me. While I was getting dinner ready, my second son got up to help, but my first son started bothering him. Because of the holiday season, my first son was already completely drunk. "Hey, John, let's go out to eat with us next time." "Dinner?" "Yeah, I'll treat, come on. Let's go, just the three of us, you, me, and Martha." "Well, I'm kinda busy though." "Come on, it's not a big deal, let's do it just this once." "Okay, got it." "Great. Then I'll leave the restaurant to you." "Yes, okay." With a wry smile, John nodded as his brother, pressing a hand on his shoulder, urged him on. He seemed a bit reluctant when Martha asked him to choose the place, but he started searching on his smartphone right away. I was worried about their forceful interaction, but since it's been their way since forever, I decided not to say anything this time either. After that, everything went smoothly, and my sons went back to their own homes. It's always a whirlwind when my sons visit, but I feel lonely once they're gone. I just hope they stay healthy and safe this year too. Some time passed, and then one early morning, the phone rang. Wondering who it could be at this hour, I answered the phone to hear it was the police. Alarmed, I asked what happened, and they told me that John had passed away. After that, I couldn't comprehend anything they said. As soon as the call ended, I felt all the color drain from my face, and I collapsed to the floor. Apparently, John had collapsed from an asthma attack on his way to work. The recent cold snap exacerbated his attacks, and since he didn't have his inhaler with him that day, he was already severely weakened by the time he was taken to the hospital. Just like that, my second son was gone forever. Crushed by despair, my mind suddenly kicked into gear, shaking me into action. First thing, I needed to contact my first son. I couldn't remember his number, so I frantically searched all over the house. Finally, I remembered there was a note with my first son's number on the corkboard above the telephone, and I grabbed the handset and called him hastily. After the phone rang several times, I could hear my first son answer with his drawn-out voice. While I was rambling on, not even sure of what I was saying myself, I was explaining the situation to my first son, but he didn't seem particularly surprised, just responding with a "huh" and "okay." At the time, I was too frantic to notice his demeanor, but looking back, I realized something was off from that moment. At one point, my first son's wife chimed in, and Michael briefly explained the situation to her. "Oh, that's tough," she might have said nonchalantly, as if she had just heard about a neighbor's quarrel. I was taken aback, and Michael responded to me lightly. "All right, we're gonna head to the hospital now." I heard the phone click off near my ear. What was I panicking for? In the hospital, facing my second son for identification, I felt no real sense of it all, and before I knew it, the day of the funeral had arrived. Driven by despair, loss, and busyness, I can't remember how I've spent the past few days. As the funeral proceeded solemnly, I was brought back to reality by the funeral director's words.
This will be your final goodbye. Please take this time to bid farewell without regrets.
Relatives who had come to pay their respects gathered around John's coffin. He had been a favorite among them due to his gentle nature. Many lamented that he had passed before his parents. I couldn't bring myself to look at John's face for a while, holding back sobs as I stepped away from the coffin. But once the crowd had cleared, I mustered the strength to peer into the coffin. He was sleeping peacefully. His face was so serene, it looked like he might wake up if I just called out to him. As soon as that thought crossed my mind, tears started welling up again. I looked down, pressing a handkerchief to my mouth. Then, I heard something being scattered over the coffin. We had already placed everything inside. Curious, I opened my eyes and saw several photos had been tossed in. Picking up the photos, wondering what this was about, I noticed the words "Scene of Infidelity." On the back of the photos were dates and names I didn't recognize. What in the world is this? I quickly looked towards where the photos had come from.
I need all of this gone. Can't leave any evidence behind.
Her arms crossed as my first son's wife looked at me with a vile smile. Led with an indescribable fear, I could only stare back at her, sweating coldly. The time for the funeral procession was nearing. I had to let everyone know about this before it was too late. Mustering my courage, I spoke up.
Martha, did you actually do something to John?
My statement caused a commotion among everyone present.
What are you talking about? John died from his chronic condition, didn't he?
Realizing there was no getting through to Martha, who just shrugged off my objections with a whatever attitude, I suddenly remembered something important and dashed off in a hurry. I could hear voices trying to stop me, but I couldn't pay any attention to them. I ran out of the funeral place and onto the main street, where I quickly hailed a taxi. I gave the driver my home address, and we took off immediately. I remember feeling desperately anxious yet oddly calm. I tried to recall where I had put the item I was looking for. Every red light made my anxiety spike, and I found myself clenching my fists without realizing it. Once home, I asked the taxi driver to wait and rushed inside. Even unlocking the door felt agonizingly slow. But I quickly found what I was looking for in the place I had pictured in my mind. I grabbed it and went back to the taxi, this time asking the driver to take me to the police station. The driver looked surprised by my frantic state but nodded and drove me to the nearest station. After paying, I dashed into the police station, explained the situation to the receptionist, and showed them what I was holding. Initially, the receptionist looked confused, but after seeing the contents, they realized this was no small matter and asked me to elaborate in a private room. As we switched places, several officers appeared to hear my story. They were already familiar with John's recent words, and my summary seemed to convey the urgency well. When I showed the contents of the envelope I was holding, the most senior detective exchanged a look with a younger one. The younger one then left the room and I kept talking about various things in the meantime. After a while, the young detective returned and reported back to the senior one. Before I knew it, I was being ushered into a police car and taken back to the funeral. As I was being taken back to the funeral in the police car, John's words kept echoing in my head.
Actually, I've discovered a secret about Michael and Martha. But I can't talk about it now. And I don't want them to find out either. Sorry, Mom. Don't ask anything, just keep this for me, please.
That's why, when John came home last New Year's, he gave me something. It was a white envelope, and it seemed like it had various things inside.
Please don't look inside. It might become unnecessary. Then, I'll come back to collect it, so just hold on to it for me.
I couldn't understand what John was talking about, but seeing him in distress, I couldn't say anything. I just smiled, took it, and then we never spoke of it again. Then Michael and Martha came home, and I was so busy that I forgot about it. I was furious with myself for completely forgetting after seeing how troubled John had been. Getting older is tough. When I opened the envelope at the police station, out came a voice recorder first. Playing it, the space filled with silence except for Michael's voice.
Come on, a little help shouldn't be a problem, right? You'd definitely get a decent bonus. Just give a little to your big brother, there's no issue. You're not married, and you don't even have a girlfriend, right?
It was definitely Michael's voice, low and hard to hear. He was coaxingly asking John for money, in a sweet-talking tone. John didn't say anything. Ignoring the silence, Michael continued to plead for money. I felt sick.
Just think of it as helping me and Martha out, just a bit. Just a little, $10,000 will do. No!
The moment Michael mentioned a specific amount of money, John muttered a response. It was a modest but firm tone, clearly refusing. Michael, perhaps irritated by this, started yelling at John in response. John fought back without backing down. He pointed out how Michael was drowning in a massive amount of debt, still continuing to gamble, and even planning to beg me for money soon. Apparently hitting a nerve, Michael just cursed out John and stormed off. That's where the recording ended. And there were more in the envelope, which included photographs depicting Martha caught in the act of infidelity, which were the same ones thrown into John's coffin. Lastly, there were several sheets of paper that seemed like diary entries detailing Michael's debt and Martha's cheating. The photos seemed to be taken by chance when John, returning home from work, witnessed Martha and a man arm in arm coming out of a hotel and impulsively took pictures with his smartphone. There were other compromising photos as well, which he must have entrusted to me in case they were found and destroyed. The police, after seeing this, although not arresting anyone, intended to bring in key witnesses regarding the incident with John from the day before. "We're here," a detective suddenly said. Shaking off my daze, I tensed up. The police car stopped in front of the funeral. Relatives were coming out in droves, wondering what was happening. I got out of the police car and headed straight for Michael and Martha. They were already isolated inside the funeral services, likely due to the words I had uttered before leaving, but that didn't matter now. As I returned with the detective, Martha's face twisted in discomfort.
"What is this? Calling the police? What do you all want coming here like this?"
As Martha pointed and yelled at me, Michael frowned suspiciously.
"Martha, what's got into you, acting all panicked? You didn't really." "I'm not panicking at all. It's just your mother saying weird things, making me look suspicious."
Faced with Michael's suspicious gaze, Martha, who was already stuttering in her defense, became completely paralyzed by my single statement. "Martha, you've been cheating, haven't you?"
"Why would you?"
Despite her previously bold demeanor, Martha's face now contorted with fear, turning pale at my assertive stance. Michael, hearing my words, turned beet red and grabbed Martha's shoulder.
"You've been cheating on me? Cheating? What do you mean by cheating? You heard that from him, didn't you? Otherwise, you wouldn't have noticed."
Martha shrieked back at Michael, trying to shake off his hand. Her hair disheveled as she began to frantically defend herself.
"Him? Are you talking about my younger brother? How would he know about your affair?"
Michael paused for a moment, then moved closer to Martha with a raised eyebrow.
"That's..."
Martha stumbled over her words, unable to come up with a rebuttal, and seizing the opportunity, Michael closed in.
"You thought if you confronted him, our weak little brother would spill everything, right? That's why you silenced him, reckless idiot."
"What do you mean?" Michael roared, his face still flushed with anger, and finally, Martha, defiant, scoffed and confessed.
"Nothing much. I took his inhaler to ensure he wouldn't talk easily, and told him to bring the money in exchange for it. And now look what happened."
Unbelievable words came from Martha's mouth. Everyone in the room gasped in shock.
"What have you done? Is money really that important to you?"
I felt like I was going to faint from the shocking revelation, but I was too angry to collapse. I firmly told Martha.
"John kept the evidence of your affair and Michael's debts to himself until the very end. He thought maybe you two would change. But you carry this sin for the rest of your lives.
At my words, Martha bit her lip and looked down, while Michael slumped. You, my precious. After a pause, Michael muttered softly. Then, suddenly lifting his head, he lunged at Martha again. But once more, Martha shook off his hand.
Precious, you say? That's because you see him as nothing but a cash cow, right? What did you say, you?
Michael clenched his fist, but a detective stepped out from behind me and restrained him. As Martha tried to escape, she was surrounded by other detectives.
We'd like to hear more about this at the station, if you'd please come with us.
At the softly murmured words, Michael and Martha flinched, their shoulders trembling as they fell silent. Then they were led away and placed in a police car, disappearing from view. The room went deathly silent. Suddenly, John's coffin made a noise as if in response. Since then, the ceremony was carried out solemnly, and today is the Mass of John. I stood praying. I handed over all the evidence of Michael and Martha's misdeeds left by John to the police. There were 4 pieces of evidence in total. These included a voice recorder with conversations between John and Michael, a homemade IOU exchanged between them, copies of a diary documenting the misdeeds of Michael and Martha, and photos capturing Martha's infidelity. I later heard from the police that Martha realized John knew about her affair during a dinner arranged forcibly by Michael and Martha during his visit home. Apparently, the dinner was intended to make John take on Michael's huge debts, as Michael was begging for money. At that time, while Michael stepped outside to smoke and John was away at the restroom, Martha, desperate for money, rummaged through John's bag. She found and took photos showing her infidelity, which she always carried and deemed dangerous if exposed. Soon after, she confronted John, who had returned early, instructed him to stay silent, and even took his inhaler, demanding money in exchange. The whole situation turned murky when Michael came back, and the day ended without a clear conclusion. What a cruel act they had committed. John must have suffered greatly without his inhaler. Wish I could make them feel the same, but Michael and Martha have been arrested. There's nothing more I can do. Rather, I hope they will be severely punished. Looking up, I gaze at the photo of John with his gentle smile. Although I'll never see such a smile again, if he can smile even just in this picture, that's all I can ask for. I headed towards John's room. It will never be used again. But I wasn't planning to clean up everything neatly. I decided to sit at his desk. As I spun the chair to face the bed, I noticed an old camera on the side table. Curiously, I picked it up. It was a birthday present we bought for him when he was young. It was already old when we got it, but it's been well maintained and still seemed usable. Suddenly, I remembered his words.
Let's go on a trip sometime. We'll take lots of photos with this camera.
Remembering his gentle face, I decided to start planning for that trip.